tell where you get this interest to the history of this 20th century? So you mostly focus on the 20th century. So why?
I entirely focus on the 20th century, and especially on the Second World War. I was born just after the war, and my father was in Special Operations Executive in the war, and I found very soon, even in childhood, that everybody was defined by whether they'd had a good war or not. And of course that fascinated me, but then later the interest developed in a different way, and one realized that actually the Second World War, and the reason why it still has its fascination today, is because it represents more moral choice than any other period in modern history. And there was a debate in Britain about it, which I think was quite interesting. People were saying, why aren't novels today set in the present, with, there are so many different issues which should be addressed, and why is it people so interested in history? And I think, as Robert McCrum, who was the literary editor of The Observer, said, the reason is simply that moral choice is the fundamental element in all human drama. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Second World War holds a fascination for me, as well as for so many other people.
Mm-hmm. Do you get any formal education in history, or?
Oh yes. Well, I mean, when I was at Sandhurst as a young officer cadet, John Keegan, who was one of the famous British historians, was my professor. And he became a great friend. And Keegan's great contribution was this book. It was a small book called The Face of Battle. And that, for the first time, turned military history upside down. It was no longer the staff officer, the general, giving a bird's eye view of what happened on the ground, as if they were chess grandmasters, which is ridiculous. It was very much more doing it from the other side, of showing what the experience was like for the soldiers in the front line. And that was something which affected me, or influenced me so much, partly because it hadn't happened before. And I was just very lucky in timing, because taking that on, there had been a period in the 1980s when oral history became very popular in Britain and the United States. And I remember a publisher saying to me, it's interesting, this thing about oral history, because people, yes, are quite interested by it, but actually the reason why it's never going to do very well is because people feel that it's not a proper book. They feel that, it's just a question of collection of diaries or interviews or whatever it might be. And that very much struck me, because I realized that actually what you needed was a combination of history from above with history from below. The oral history was showing people, especially the young in a post-military health and safety generation, what the reality of total warfare was like. And so that is why I was always working towards that, in that particular direction. And it turned out that after the 80s and the 90s and so forth, people were looking very much more at a more individual version of history rather than the collective version of history of the past.
Mm-hmm. So the interest of the Russian participation in the war, was it some sort of coincidence, or how was it born?
It came about in a strange way. I had worked in the Russian archives when they first opened in 1992, when they first opened to the foreigners in 1992.
You did it in person?
I did it in person, well, with a translator. At the time. We worked very closely together, side by side. But this was actually very much more on the French Communist Party, because I was doing a book at the time on Paris after the liberation. And I realized what a phenomenal resource the Russian Soviet archives were in terms of their scope and so forth. And then it was later that actually I was trying to do a totally different book, when my publisher said, listen, we think it's an interesting idea, but we'd much prefer you to write a book about Stalingrad, about the Battle of Stalingrad, because there hasn't really been anything. And it just happened that Podolsk, thanks to Pikoya, who was the Minister of the Archives, who had made the archives open up, I think I was about one of the first historians into Podolsk, into Zamol. And what I realized was that the really interesting material was going to lie in the political department reports. And I remember at the Ministry of Defense, when we were negotiating access or whatever, the colonel there, and it was quite obvious that the army was not used to dealing with foreign historians and their approach to history. He said, "We have a simple rule in our archive. You tell us the subject, we choose the files." And there was no point. There was no point trying to say. Well, actually, Colonel, it's not doesn't work like that in other archives. So I said, "Yes, of course." But I said, to give you an idea of the sort of material I'm looking for, in the German military archives in Freiburg, in Breisgau, the most interesting articles, the most interesting reports are those by doctors and priests attached to the German army, because they're outsiders and they're giving a really sort of the human detail which I'm interested in. Roar of laughter from the Russian colonel. "No priests in the Red Army." And I said, "No, okay, I realize that, but what about the political department reports?" And that was where the really interesting material was. And the reason for that was because Stalin was so desperate to know the absolute truth of what was going on in Stalingrad. He didn't know whether the generals were lying to him or whatever it was, that the political department of the Stalingrad front was having to fly back a report every single night of between 12 and 24 pages on exactly what had happened that particular day. And here you had the version uncontaminated by any sort of propaganda. It was the exact details of the genuine heroism of soldiers, the genuine successes, but also the genuine failures, and the crossing over to the enemy, surrender, whatever it might be. And so this was absolute gold in sort of archival sense.
John Erickson.
Yes, I worked with John. He was wonderful. He was a huge help to me, especially on the Stalingrad book and in his advice. He was a very generous man.
He is actually the author of the road. Yeah, the Battle of Stalingrad and
the
Road to
Stalingrad and the Road to Berlin.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely fantastic books.
They were fantastic books. Not easy to read for the general public because there was sort of just so much detail. But in many ways, it was John who sort of opened up the subject for the British, I think. And John was completely objective. I mean, there was no doubt about it. He was there. He was working in those archives and from a much earlier stage. But he was also a huge help when it came to me later, when there was the big debate over David Glantz and Operation Mars, a subject which I'm sure we'll come on to later.
It was so. What was the basement of the discussion between you and Glantz?
Well, it wasn't so much Glantz didn't attack me, but I was attacked by Jason Epstein, who had been one of the founders of the New York Review of Books. And Epstein had this sort of I don't know particularly why, where it came from. One or two friends who knew him extremely well said they'd been rather astonished by the ferocity of his attack and what caused it. The point was that Glantz, in his book on Mars, was quite right to say that the Operation Mars, which was this attack against the German Ninth Army close to Rzhev, was not, he said, tried to argue, was not a diversion. He felt that was a major operation. Now, John Erickson was very dubious about it, but also at the time, Professor Oleg Rzhezhevsky, was being a great help to me. He was passing me more material on Stalingrad. This was after the Stalingrad book, obviously. And he also passed me the discussions which they'd had in the Association of Second World War Historians on Glantz's book, where he said it's very interesting what Glantz has come up with and all the rest of it. But is he right? And actually what then came up when I could start to look at other sources, and one saw, in fact, that Glantz's theory that Zhukov had spent his whole time working on the Rzhev front was totally wrong, because actually the diary of Zhukov's movements showed that he was spending far more time down in Stalingrad and working on Operation Uranus, and was not working on Operation Mars. And then, of course, there was General Suleplatov, who describes how Mars was entirely a diversion, because the NKVD special task actually, through one of the agents, actually gave the information, the details of the attack in advance to the Germans, purely to make sure that they kept their troops there. And in fact, actually, I think it was probably one of the most cynical operations of deception in the whole of, almost the whole of the history of warfare, but certainly in the Second World War, because altogether some 215,000 casualties resulted.
Yeah, but you believe that Sudar Plato is right?
Obviously, one can never be 100%, but I had long conversations with his son, who had worked actually on the book with his father and his son, Professor Sudar Platov, who I found, I must say, very convincing. He was certain, in fact, that his father would not have invented that particular story about Operation Monastery and the handing of the information over to the Germans. But in any case, as leaving that aside, as Professor Rzeszewski and was it General Gareev, Colonel General Gareev, who was the one who actually wrote up his appreciation or assessment of Glantz's theory. The whole point was that actually the ammunition provided in support of the artillery ammunition provided in support of Mars was virtually zero. I mean, very, very little indeed, which showed that actually it was a sacrifice rather than a major operation. Operation Uranus had many times more ammunition loads per gun per day than in Mars, and that was, as far as Rzeszewski and his colleagues were concerned, that was perhaps probably the decisive element. So, whether or not we believe Sudar Platov, I think that there's no doubt about it, that Mars was definitely a deception operation, or yes, a deception operation, rather than a major attack. The trouble was that Glantz in his book was so frustrated by not finding any material in the archives that he actually started inventing, as he admitted himself. I mean, it was very strange. I mean, it was the only time I've come across a historian who's actually filled in, should we say, the gaps in the same sort of way, which is slightly bizarre. But Glantz is a very important and serious historian, but I just think that he got carried away on that particular book. He got carried away by his own thesis.
Mm-hmm. So, back to the history.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? Was it a Russian success, or was it...
Well, I mean, was it a Russian success? I mean, it was, should we say, a temporary success, but it was not a success in the way that Stalin hoped. Stalin hoped that by encouraging Hitler to attack France first, and one has to remember, even Churchill was still thinking of the French army in 1939 as the French army of 1918, when it wasn't. It was basically a shadow of its former self. Not just a question of numbers, but above all a question of morale and a question of discipline and all the rest of it. And the quality of its generals. Gamelin was disastrous and a fantasist in many ways. So from that point of view, and also the French, as we know, were desperately reluctant to fight. The British had been reluctant to fight up until March 1939, when, with the occupation of Prague, it was obvious finally that Hitler was a total liar and was going to go on attacking, and that all of his promises were totally wrong. And I'm afraid it needed that long for the British to wake up. But the French were still very reluctant to fight, and afterwards they always blamed the British for actually having forced them into the Second World War when they were incapable of fighting. My uncle was a journalist, he was Reuters correspondent in France, and I remember him telling me how he would say to the French soldiers, but, there are German troops over there, and this is when they were already fighting in Poland and all the rest. He said, the German troops, aren't you going to fight at them? I said, what? Fire at them? If we fire at them, they'll fire back. I mean, it was pretty. It was pretty pathetic, to put it mildly, which is why it was called the Phony War during that particular period. But going back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin though didn't succeed in another way, and that is by this hope that the strength of the French army would wear down the Wehrmacht, and then he, Stalin, would be in a position to impose whatever he wanted afterwards, was not going to work. And Stalin was furious about this, and this was one of the reasons why, for example, particularly at the Tehran conference, he said the French should be made to pay. One of the reasons why he was so angry was, of course, that the French army did not destroy their vehicles, and up to 80% of vehicles in German divisions invading Russia came from the French army. So it was hardly surprising that Stalin was pretty angry with the French. And his attitude only started to change after de Gaulle's visit in December 1944 to Moscow, when it suddenly occurred to Stalin, well, actually, the French might be useful after all, because de Gaulle was the wild card within the Western alliance, and therefore might be useful to... But all of this really comes to the origins of the Cold War, which I think is an interesting subject in itself, which I hope we'll get onto later on.
Yeah. And what about the British position on just before the Molotov Pact in April and in August, where the French and Brits came to Moscow for the negotiations,
yes.
and which was failed.
Yes, I can understand the Soviet attitude. You know, why should they take a ship, which was one of the slowest ships going, which showed basically that they weren't interested. Well, in fact, they were interested, but at the same time, there were two problems. One, of course, was the anti-communism of Neville Chamberlain. He just simply could not believe that any worthwhile alliance with the Soviet Union could work. But the other problem was actually it was the position of the Poles, because the whole system was only going to work if the Poles were going to allow the Red Army across their territory in support and into Romania if the Germans attacked eastwards. And from that point of view, the Poles, and one has to, should we say, understand it when looking at subsequent events, did not believe that they would ever be able to get the Red Army to leave afterwards. So they were absolutely fundamentally against it. So actually the British and the French negotiators were in an impossible position. So whether it was a success short term, yes. Whether it was a success long term, I don't think it was. It gave him a little bit of breathing space at a time when we have to remember the Red Army was desperately vulnerable after the purges, and above all the command structure, which still suffered. I mean, even in 1941, in the disastrous summer of 1941, because the senior officers were so terrified of the NKVD and being arrested and all the rest of it, that nobody dared take decisions when they needed to.
Do you think that the purges is really had a big impact on the Red Army? Not the sheer size. I mean, the army is growing about 5 times in a couple of years, and there was not enough officers for it.
It's true there weren't enough officers, but then if you purge your senior officers, you also actually frighten them in terms of getting them to make decisions. And this was the disastrous thing in 1941, because nobody dared to retreat unless they had orders from above, and with the collapse of communications they weren't able to get orders from above and all the rest of it. So it was not just a question of the numbers of senior officers who had been purged, but it was the psychological effect on the command structure of the Red Army, which was so disastrous, I would say.
What's your attitude towards Stalin? Is he a great man, or
what's interesting, if one compares Stalin and Hitler as war leaders, Stalin was disastrous at the beginning, but then suddenly became a very effective war leader, war commander, in terms of giving his generals their head at the right moment. In the early part, as I say, in 41, and to a certain degree from the first half at least of 42, he was disastrous, frankly. But then, as I say, he started to give the generals their head. Hitler, on the other hand, had actually been quite effective at the beginning, but then became increasingly disastrous, until he got to the point where the British cancelled Operation Foxley, which was the plan to assassinate Hitler by SOE. And because they realized that actually the war would be won rather more rapidly with Hitler in command than a successor commander or leader. So from that point of view, ironically, of course, Stalin cancelled plans to assassinate Hitler, but for very different reasons. That was because he feared that the Western allies, the British and the Americans, might make a deal with a successor government if Hitler was assassinated, and he didn't trust them. Actually, there was no chance of I mean, after the statement at Casablanca by Roosevelt on unconditional surrender, there was no way that the British or the Americans could have gone back on that. But the British and the Americans did make a major mistake in 1944 with the July plot, the attempt to blow up Hitler by his own officers, because they assumed on that basis that any army which was prepared to kill their own commander-in-chief must be in a state of disintegration. Well, yes, there's a superficial logic in that, but it's a question of, you've got to understand, this is one of the classic intelligence failures of the Second World War, you've got to understand the mentality. You've got to understand the mind, get into the mind of the German commanders, because the very fact that Hitler survived meant that actually the Nazis were going to, and the SS and obviously Hitler, were going to be able to control the German army with a far tighter fist right up to the end of the war, and therefore the war would go on until the day Hitler died, rather than any hope of it being ended by individual surrenders of German troops. And it wasn't until right up at the very end, with Wolf in Sweden, in Italy and so forth, that this disintegration started to happen.
Mm-hmm. And back to the Stalin issue, I mean, in
Yes.
general, not only in the war, what's your attitude to him?
Well, I would agree with Sakharov, Andrei Sakharov, on that. You know that Stalin killed many more people than Hitler, but Hitler had to be defeated first, and there's no doubt about that. Because with the hunger plan and the idea of the elimination of 30 million Soviet civilians. It would have been a catastrophe which would have dwarfed even the Shoah, even the Holocaust. So from that point of view, I don't think there's any doubt about it. But Stalin was a killer, there's no doubt about it. He was a very effective leader. And this brings out other differences between, obviously, you know, a dictatorship at war and democracies at war. And there are many ironies, which again is another subject we could always get onto, which I think is quite interesting. But Stalin himself was by the end, was a great war leader in terms of Soviet power. That's absolutely true. I mean, even Churchill and his advisors were appalled at how effective and clever he was at Yalta and Tehran in those major conferences. By the time of Potsdam, he was in a completely superior position, if you like, from that point of view. So he was a brilliant diplomatist, and obviously he had a very, very clear focus. That didn't make him a nice man. And when you see actually the purges of the Red Army in 1945, which I think have tended to be underestimated, it's pretty terrifying. And he was afraid, obviously, of Bonapartism, of being. He was afraid of Zhukov, which was one of the reasons why Zhukov didn't discover for 20 years that actually Hitler's body had been found. But that was all part of Stalin's tricks to try to keep his generals under control. But his attitude towards the Soviet people, I think, was shown by that notorious speech when he referred to them as the screws and cogs in the machine.
Wow, no, not really. It was a true.
Come on, come on. I mean, you know, I think that was a very, very revealing. That was a very revealing speech.
Okay. Do you think that the American capital was? Well, I'm talking quite a lot with the German veterans, German Wehrmacht and SS veterans, and most of them say that it's Americans who was actually started the Second World War. What do you think about it?
Well, they say that, but I mean, most people in Germany still believe that it was the Americans who declared war on Germany, when in fact it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. And you know, you tell Germans that and they look at you in total disbelief. So I wouldn't rely on what German veterans say on that. Now, what is true is that and this may have played their part, the American capital played a very strong role in the Spanish Civil War. Texaco, various banks and all the rest of it who were financing Franco during that particular period, the role of the Telecom, the Telefonica, ITT, as it later became. All of these organizations did play a large role. No, the one has to remember the situation that Roosevelt was not able to give arms or sell arms even to the British and the Americans, even when they paid for it, because of the Neutrality Act, which had been passed during the Spanish Civil War. So he had his hands tied. There was very little that American organizations could do. I mean, they would love to have been able to sell weapons to the British and the French. And actually, the British and the French did manage to buy a certain amount, and actually they paid very high prices in 1939. And this actually, as many Americans refused to acknowledge, helped actually trigger the American economic takeoff, which obviously became huge during the Second World War. One has to remember that up until that point, it was still the tail end of the Depression in America, and America had been hit far harder than any other country, except perhaps Germany, by the Depression. So there was that aspect. But I mean, the Americans were absolutely brutal towards the British in terms of when Lend-Lease was announced. And they provided weapons. The British had to prove that they were bankrupt. And for that, the Americans secretly in the deal, and this was never said at the time, took over every single British company in the United States and North America, including Cortez, which was one of the richest. And they also sent a cruiser to South Africa to pick up the last of Britain's gold reserves before. So, although Churchill in the House of Commons described it as one of the most unsordid acts in history, i.e. that it was one of the most generous acts in history, it wasn't. It was very, very hard-headed. Again, that is something that you don't hear very much from American historians on.
Yeah, well, Americans were the only, profited from the war.
Yes, they did. Hugely. Yeah. They profited hugely. I mean, not only did they become a superpower, this is the fascinating thing about the Tehran Conference, that you saw Stalin as a result of the victory at Stalingrad and what would have followed in the advances in 1943. You see Stalin and the Soviet Union as suddenly emerging as not just as a great power, but actually as a superpower, one of the two world superpowers. The British position and, of course, the French, because the two empires were in collapse and they were both bankrupt. And of course, the Americans were the others. So suddenly, one had this sort of this binary world.
Do you think that the key motive to fight for the Russians were the fear of NKVD or some sort of punishment? Was it the motivation to?
No, there was real motivation. One had to see. One only had to look at the lines of volunteers on the first day after the invasion. I mean, even though Molotov made one of the worst speeches probably at the time, there was no doubt there was an absolute outrage on behalf of the Russian, the Soviet people. And they were all queuing up to fight. The interesting thing is, and I do think this is a terribly important subject, which has never really been covered in Russia, is when one talks about the actual fighting capacities of the different countries during the Second World War. And their different motivations. Now, in the case, obviously, of the Soviet Union, there was that feeling of outrage. The numbers of volunteers who came forward, whether it was for the army or even just to help in some ways, it was the greatest in the whole of any country in the Second World War. There's no doubt about that. The German civilians weren't that excited at the start of the Second World War. The only time they were excited was the return from France when they thought that the war was over, not knowing that Hitler had this plan to invade the Soviet Union. The British felt, well, it's something we've got to do, but there was no sort of, not excitement, but there was no determination really. It was just the feeling it's something we've got to do. In Russia, it was totally different. In the Soviet Union, it was totally different. But the interesting thing is, when one looks at, say, Stalingrad, and one looks at the fight there, no Western army would have survived at Stalingrad. There's no doubt about it. And this is, again, the difference between the armies of dictatorships and the armies of democracies. They held on partly to a large degree out of real determination, but also because of the pressure, the threat of execution by NKVD, by the special departments. And that's no surprise. I mean, frankly, the fighting conditions at Stalingrad were worse than probably any other battle in the Second World War. I mean, it's always hard to compare these things. So yes, one knows, and the numbers. So there's a debate over that, over the figures. It was John Ericsson who came up with the figure of the 13,500 executions for the whole of the Stalingrad campaign. Some people though have Jochen Helwig have sort of cast doubt on that. I'm not sure. I think that his was a much more narrower focus. So it's a question of how you debate these things. But as I was saying, with those reports, which were absolutely reliable from the political department of the Stalingrad front, there was no doubt that there was both genuine heroism and obviously there was cases of genuine cowardice and of crossing over to the enemy and things like that by soldiers who were basically civilians who had a rifle thrust into their hands and arms. Now, the interesting thing was that the British were the first to do any research into fighting capacity and fighting intent. And in 1943, a Major Lionel Wigram did this report, having done a lot of research and interviews and so forth. And he came up with this report saying that within the average platoon of 30 men, there were probably about 3 or 4 who were the real fighters. There were probably about 3 or 4 who wanted to run away at the first opportunity. And the main group in between would follow the fighters if things were going well, or would run away with the others when they were going badly. Now, the Germans actually had a very similar analysis of their own troops. Now, I'm talking here of average conscript troops. I'm not talking about elite divisions like paratroopers or Waffen-SS or anything like that on either side. And they had the same thing, the Einsatzfreudigen, those who loved fighting, the Einsatzgehemmten, and those who would sort of run away and all the rest of it. The Americans did much more research towards the end of the war, a large amount, and they found actually that the majority of soldiers didn't actually even fire their weapon in battle. They just sort of kept their heads down. Funny enough, I remember in some of the Russian documents, there were Red Army officers who were saying that after each engagement we should have a rifle inspection and anybody with a clean barrel should be shot as a deserter. So I think all the armies were actually on average troops, as I say, were finding fairly similar contrast between the really good soldiers and those who were bad soldiers. So when one talks about sort of the Red Army soldier, you can never generalize. I mean, there were some really superb, many superb and very, very brave ones. But also there were going to be others, as we know from all of the reports, who were going to try and escape at the first opportunity, just like the British Army and probably the Americans too. I mean, the numbers of deserters from both the British Army and the American Army by 1944 was pretty staggering, as there were from the Red Army. So, I think the important thing is to try to look at it in as objective a way as one possibly can, which is never very easy, and understand it. Rather than try to make a sacred version of what one's own soldiers from one's own country achieved during the Second World War. Coffee break. Excellent.
Did Stalin plan his own invasion?
This is all of the icebreaker conspiracy theory and all the rest of it. I didn't think so at all for a number of reasons. I don't think that the Red Army was in either, certainly not psychologically, in a position really to execute that sort of operation. Now, we know that there was this document of the 11th of May, but that actually is a perfectly normal, in the circumstances, a perfectly normal contingency planning document. Produced by Zhukov and other members of the Stavka. though I don't think the staff guy was actually officially in action at that particular point, but of the general staff, and was assessing all of the different options. And one of them, of course, was a preemptive attack on Germany to disrupt what they already knew were going to be plans for a Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. But Stalin, of course, was in this, as we know, obsessive frame of mind that his great coup of the Nazi-Soviet pact was not going to go wrong, that it wasn't in the Germans' interest to attack him. And so he started to swallow these ridiculous lies of the Germans that actually they were putting all these troops onto his eastern borders, or rather Stalin's western borders, so as to avoid them being bombed by the British and all the rest of it. I mean, the fact that Stalin could have believed that for a moment is astonishing. But the point was, I really don't think that, they were in any position to invade, apart from anything else, during that particular summer, in that particular June. For example, the artillery tractors were helping with the harvest. There was no question of any of those Soviet armies being in a position really to invade. They didn't have the ammunition supplies, they didn't have the fuel supplies in the right position or anything like that. So I think that it is a totally false theory, frankly.
And if we talk about the beginning of the Second World War, was it actually started in 1931 as a Western Central idea, or it's actually in 1937 where the Chinese were invaded by Japan?
Well, some Chinese historians would go in fact to 31 from the point of view of the occupation of Manchuria. So one can go back, but I mean, it's should we say it's a favourite debate amongst many British historians. Did the war start in the 19th century, and was it an extension of that, or was it 1914, or was it 1917 to 1990? I mean, it's amazing. But honestly, it is amazing, and you can spend a lot of time. But it's rather like medieval priests, debating how many angels on the point of a pin. Okay. The long war of the 20th century, yes.
What do you think? Do you think of the democracy and totalitarism? Do you have what key shortages totalitarism, in your view, has?
What one saw in the Second World War, whether it was a question of Germany or to a certain degree of the Soviet Union, was that the ability to innovate seems to have been greatly reduced by the system, by the authoritarian system. On the whole, the Americans and the British made far better use of their scientists and technical experts and so forth, inventing weapons. I was very intrigued. In fact, I got bitterly attacked by a German historian for suggesting that, not suggesting, actually, it was based entirely on a Schaeff report from Eisenhower's headquarters in 1945, saying that it's very interesting the way that so many Germans now are trying to say, oh, well, it was a big mistake to persecute the Jews because just think of the wonderful weapons they could have made for us. Einstein, just think what he could have produced for us. I mean, a lack of imagination, which is of such a staggering element. And anyway, I was attacked for saying, not appreciating the way that the Germans actually were in a state of shock in 1945, and they couldn't possibly have thought things like that. Well, I'm sorry, this was based on interviews by the British and American interrogators of Germans at the end of the war. So I was not prepared to accept those criticisms. But in general terms, you have an innovation which is important. You also have other paradoxes. And one of the terrible paradoxes, and it really is a terrible paradox, and it's still to a certain degree true today, is that democracies are more likely to kill more civilians than dictatorships. And people are always shocked by this. But actually it's true, because the generals, the commanders of British, American, whoever, are under such pressure from public opinion at home, from the press, from Parliament and so forth, to reduce their own casualties, that they're therefore going to rely that much more on a high explosive. i.e. on bombing or on shelling or whatever. And it's one of the shocking things, and I think I wasn't terribly popular when I pointed out that actually in France, the British and Americans killed more French civilians than British were killed by the German Air Force. And that was not, as you might imagine, a terribly popular thing to point out. But I'm afraid it's true that you do get this terrible paradox because the democracies are that much more conscious about their own casualties. Hitler actually said we need casualties. Even amongst his own SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, it summons up the blood, and he actually thought that it was sort of heroic and necessary. Stalin, I think, was completely indifferent to casualties. But it's interesting how, according to Levada research in Russia, that the attitude of Russians towards the unnecessary casualties of the Second World War has now declined from 37% down to 12% who felt that Stalin was responsible for an unnecessary level of casualties. So I think this shows to a large degree, the rehabilitation of Stalin.
Was it actually the Stalin, or was it sort of the attitude to the casualties among the people?
Well, I don't think that the people, when one talks about the people, the ordinary people whose sons, brothers, fathers were sent off to the war, I don't think that their attitude was that one of in any way welcoming casualties or just being indifferent to them. Of course they weren't indifferent to them. I think that Soviet generals were certainly pretty indifferent. As one knows, when you got to read the diaries of, say, Vasily Grossman and others, and the way that, quite often some of these commanders were fairly drunk and they'd sort of say, oh, send them back, go back into the attack or whatever, when it was obvious that the attack wasn't going to work. But it was also a product of the chain of command in the Red Army that, if the boss said, you've got to attack, otherwise you're going to be sent off to a punishment battalion or, to a staff coterie or whatever it might be. That did put, shall we say, a certain urgency, if you like, into what they were going to do. And they were more interested in, if you like, preserving their position than they were in saving the lives of their own men.
Yeah, but it's also, it's also a problem of the people who is ready to die, and it was, it was a fame to die for the country.
Sure.
And
yes,
I mean, they were ready, so it means the casualty can be higher than usual.
Yes, I agree with you. That is certainly an element. I mean, I was very much struck by the letters home that we came across, hello mama, hello papa, I'm ready to die for the country and all the rest of it. Not very reassuring for their parents to receive. I am well, but we're all ready to die. Yes, you're right. But also, to a certain degree, that was not necessarily the attitude of every single soldier. I think it was certainly the attitude of the most dedicated ones. But as I was saying earlier, not every armies are very varied things, both emotionally and psychologically, and not everybody is going to, even though many may be determined to lose their lives in support of the country, many are not. Can you imagine British or Canadians or Americans, wanting to lay down their life for Churchill or President Roosevelt? No way. And yet you had the sort of young SS who were simply saying they were even pulling out blood transfusions in British hospitals because they were getting English blood into their veins, and for them this was horrific. In fact, it was quite funny because there was one nurse who was having so much trouble with one Waffen-SS prisoner or whatever. She said unless he behaved, she was going to start giving him some Jewish blood in transfusions.
Your book, Fall of Berlin, is not published in Russian anymore, so there was a big problem with it. What sort of the problem was it?
Interestingly, before the book came out, Karazin, who was then the Russian ambassador in London, knew that it was going to be controversial. This was because there had been a very irritating article in the Daily Telegraph speculating on what was in the book. And this was 6 months before the book was published. And so anyway, so he said, you must come to lunch. He said, just the two of us, a vodka lunch. So we had a very interesting and enjoyable lunch. And Karasin sort of said, and he was quite right about this, and I have to admit that it hadn't really occurred to me. He said, and you've got to understand that the victory is sacred. Now, sacred, holy.
Sacred. Okay.
And suddenly I realized what he meant. It also meant that even those who'd hated Stalin, even those who'd been in the Gulag, for them there was one thing which everybody in the Soviet Union could feel proud about, and that was the victory over the fascist beast. After generations of suffering, whether in the First World War, before the First World War, in the First World War, the Civil War, the famines, the purges, and so forth, even those who'd suffered under the Stalinist regime could still feel proud and part of the national victory. And the trouble was that, of course, there was also the aspect of the mass rapes. And there'd been a certain amount of work done in Germany and elsewhere. And there in the Russian archives, there was a huge amount of material. And that's when I suddenly started to realize that people were going to get extremely upset, because nothing would undermine the sacred aspect than the mass rapes. Now, the first thing, of course, is that not all, by any means, soldiers were rapists. And there were many who were, as I say in the book, there were many who were, say, ideological communists who were appalled by what was happening. But in fact, the Red Army was out of control. The officers did not have control over their own soldiers. Those who tried to stop some of the rapes were even sort of shot down by their own men. And I was also intrigued by studies by various psychiatrists, Igor Kohn, for example, on the phenomenon and on why it had happened. Because, of course, and the reason for going into it was, of course, in the West, there's always been a tremendous debate about, is rape a weapon of war? Susan Brown-Miller had written a book, Against Their Will, which was about rape in war and all the rest of it. And because there was so much material in the archives, in GAF, there was the reports of the NKVD frontier troops behind the lines, reporting back on the mass suicides of German women because they couldn't face being gang raped yet again. There were the accounts of Grossman and many others who kept diaries with the armies as they advanced into Germany. And then, of course, there were other reports in Argaspi and so forth about even the mass rape of Russian and Ukrainian women and girls sent for slave labor in Germany. And that, I must say, I had no idea about. That did shock me. And there was this very detailed report by General Tsigankov saying that, this is a problem because these women may return to the Soviet Union with negative views of the Red Army, which was pretty shocking that nothing was done really to stop it. Until, rather too late, the order only came on the 14th of April, just before the big attack of the 16th of April against Berlin, when Ilya Ehrenberg was stopped from any of his anti-German propaganda describing Germany as the blonde witch and all the rest of it, because they'd realized what how counter-effective, counterproductive rather, the rapes were, because they were actually forcing the Germans to fight on far more desperately, thinking that it was the only way to protect their women from what was happening. Now, I found for them in most of the archives that we looked at, and the reports going to Beria and to Stalin, that the figure of, the very round figure, obviously an estimate of 2 million German women who suffered in this way, which was originally came up with, it was Helke Sander and her team who came up with this back in, I think it was the 1980s sometime, that was probably not much of an exaggeration, but obviously, there's no question of ever anybody coming up with a figure. And we interviewed a number with the BBC. We interviewed a large number of veterans, number of whom would simply say, "Oh, I never saw anything," or whatever. And then as soon as the microphones were switched off, they said, "Yes, of course we did," and the German women loved it, they just lifted their skirts for us and all the rest of it. So it was, there were that of course was not in any way a serious source, but it sort of did rather confirm the mentality. But I think that what one has to do is, and this is where Igor Kohn was so interesting, why there was this compulsion to rape. One had to remember that Stalinist society had become very prudish. There was a tremendous suppression of any form of sort of sexuality. The way that, for example, even the propaganda posters, the women were all wearing, boiler suits, and there was no question of any suggestion of breasts or anything like that. And Kohn sort of said, the trouble was that this suppression created a form of barracks eroticism, was the phrase he used, amongst all of these mainly young males who'd never really been with a woman or had any idea. And also one of the reasons why perhaps they felt they had to get drunk before they did their hunting parties at night for German women. But I was advised by a couple of historians, but above all by Catherine Meredith, who was a tremendous help. She sort of said, "Listen, you've got to start thinking about the materials." She said, "It's very, very important, but you've got to make sure that you're sort of understanding your own material properly." And she was quite right in that way. Because what one found was that the initial attack into East Prussia was basically what Susan Brown Miller and all the Western feminists had described as not an act of sex, but an act of violence, pure violence. And that certainly was, you've only got to look at sort of Solzhenitsyn's, Prussian poem of Prussian Nights. But generally, certainly the reports from the NKVD of women committing suicide, killing their own children and all the rest of it because of the ferocity of the attacks. But by the time the Red Army reached Berlin, it was a very different situation. And there it was much more a question of sexual opportunism, i.e. they were searching out for the most attractive women with torches in the cellars and in the air raid shelters or whatever. Which was not the same. It was not pure violence at all, necessarily. I mean, there were occasional acts of violence or whatever. And so this tended to contradict, if you like, the Western feminist position that sort of all rape is pure violence and it's got nothing to do with sex. And so Catherine Meredith advised me. She said, "Antony, you're walking into a minefield." She said, "Forget Russia, but you're walking to a minefield in the West as well, because no man should really be writing about rape in war." And I said, "Well, listen, the trouble about the definition that it's just pure violence and nothing to do with sex is actually the victim's definition of the crime. It doesn't help you at all in understanding the male psychology." And again, one saw from, again, one of the two things that Kohn had said in his book and others, that actually one of the elements was the way that many of the Red Army soldiers, and there was even a mutiny on this, had been felt so humiliated during the course of the war, the fact that they had to crawl out into no man's land to take the clothes off dead comrades because there was such a shortage of uniforms. There was a feeling of humiliation, and then so as a result, when males particularly have been humiliated, there is a compulsion to take out revenge on the most easy target, and of course the German women were the obvious target even more than the men. And this is what one might describe as a knock-on theory of oppression. They had been oppressed and therefore they were taking it out on others. Now, some of the Western armies, the French, for example, they encouraged their colonial troops to rape German women. The sack of Stuttgart was appalling. Karlsruhe was also very bad. I went through the French army documents from their provost march battalions, the Prévoté. But the interesting thing is, and this is what Sandow and those German feminists who were working on the whole subject back in the 80s point out, they said, funny enough, the British Army, and I'm not trying in any way to say the British Army was better, but what was interesting was that the British Army probably did less raping than the other Allied armies, for the simple reason that the British Army, because of its traditions, where the officers were always so idle that they allowed the sergeants to organize everything. the sergeants, and this is one of the reasons why the British didn't have mutinies so much in the First World War like the French, was that the sergeants were all determined to make sure that they knew where every single one of their soldiers was. There was no question of them wandering off. What we tend to underestimate was that, particularly in 1945, the Red Army actually had rather lost discipline in some ways. There were so many of the sergeants had been killed or had actually been promoted to officers and all the rest of it, that they did not have a strong NCO, non-commissioned officer structure. And soldiers were able to wander off, do everything or do anything they wanted and all the rest of it. And there was very, very little control. One always imagines that under a Stalinist regime that everything was strictly controlled, but that was not the case in Germany in 1945.
I think that, well, in my opinion, control was in place because I read quite a lot of the papers
Yes.
where they said that they start to fight against the looting, against the raping, not because they don't like it, but because the army has to fight, and they drop the morale, and the army is not. So, do you think that? So you think that there is no control?
No, I'm not saying there is no control. I'm simply saying that there is comparatively little control. And I mean, in fact, one even finds this in reports on some of the NKVD security units of that thing, where they were doing quite a lot of looting and raping themselves. The whole thing was, the trouble was that all of the reports, they were always using euphemisms, good communist euphemisms, violence against the civilian population. They never used the word rape or anything like that. Or they would regard regrettable phenomena. All of these sort of phrases were used. But there was no doubt how much it was going on. I think it was only right towards the end, when they realized what a counterproductive effect it was having, that the party line changed on that time of when Stalin wrote that article.
But it's also difficult when you're 3 years, you fight against the fascists, and you want to come to the country,
yes,
which has started the war,
and take revenge.
Yes, the revenge.
But a lot of it was also conditioned to a certain degree by the revenge propaganda, particularly of 1942, when, both in posters and in rhetoric and literature, the motherland was always, the invasion was always depicted as the rape of the motherland. So already rape was seen as a German
already done.
Yes,
yeah.
And so therefore this was revenge. But revenge was not the only. What I was trying to say was that revenge was not the only element. There were other elements which played in psychologically into the reason for what happened. But anyway, as I say, it was a question of trying to understand the phenomenon, because there was such a debate in the West about the feminist view or whatever, which was so extreme, which I disagreed with. In fact, I had a furious row with a member of Parliament the other day, a woman who simply said, all rape is a weapon of war. Well, I mean, come on, hang on. Life is not as simple as that.
So, about your book, will it be published?
I don't know. Well, it has been published, but it was published in a very censored way. Mm-hmm. And we'll see. But no, I mean, there are many ironies, and certainly. I have been accused of being the chief slanderer of the Red Army, and a whole series of things like that. And maybe it'll take time, and maybe I hope that it'll be, Russian historians who will look into it themselves and do something. But I mean, the problem is also a question of the system in Russia of access to archives and so forth. To what degree they will be able to do it and still be able to publish. But I think it's a debate which Russia needs to have itself. Rather than this sort of very fixed idea, the victory was sacred and nothing must be allowed to touch it.
Yeah.
Artem, you look totally unconvinced, but anyway.
No, yeah, yes.
I'm partly unconvinced.
Not partly unconvinced. Okay. Well, of course, I know a lot, and I interviewed the veterans, and most of them think Yeah, we know about these cases. I personally didn't. So that was the whole attitude.
Yes, yes.
So
Yes, but it's a bit like the one.
but from my experience, from my knowledge, it was not organized. First of all,
No, I agree.
it was not organized
No.
by any sort of commanders or whatever.
No.
So it was a pure initiative.
But
from-
Stalin did not want to interfere. I mean, as we know from the
It
conversation
wasn't.
with Gilas, he was sort of simply saying, let the boys have some fun.
I think it took 2 months to start to fight against.
Mhm.
Yeah, but for 2 months, definitely nothing was done to
Yeah.
prevent it.
Yeah.
But then in let's say end of March, beginning of April, they started to fight against the looting and the rape because the morale went down and the troops were not ready to fight.
Yeah.
And that's
No, but some commanders, it also varied from commander to commander. I mean, Rokossovsky certainly made efforts in that direction. But I mean, one's only got to look at one or two of, of the personal memoirs of officers at the time, of, what was likely to happen if you did try and stop them. Because, I mean, these guys, they were all armed and they were drunk, and they didn't like being told not to do it.
Okay, and the last, I think, question. So, how do you think why the Cold War started?
Well, it's very interesting. Margaret Macmillan, who is a great friend, is going to be doing a book on all of the major conferences of the Second World War. I know there have already been several. But we've talked about it quite a bit before, because I'd always been trying to push her as being the ideal person who should do a book on the origins of the Cold War. And there was a very interesting conference at the Royal Academy in Brussels, in Belgium, on the anniversary of Yalta a few years ago. And with a wide range of Russian, French, Polish, German, British, and Belgian historians. And I certainly was arguing that actually the Cold War was going to become inevitable ever since June 1941, for the simple reason that Stalin was so shocked by the German invasion that he was determined that there had to be a cordon sanitaire to prevent any surprise attack against the Soviet Union in the future. And so he was determined to have Poland, in fact, if you like, as the keystone of a basically communist bloc, which was going to go all the way from the Baltic all the way down to the Black Sea and the Adriatic, to prevent any surprise attack in the future. And what was interesting was at the Yalta, the way that Churchill, he warned Churchill fairly clearly in coded language. We have done nothing in France, i.e., in fact, it's true. Stalin was a man of his word in the sense that he prevented a French communist uprising in France, and with Torres, when he sent Torres back to France, or allowed De Gaulle said, right, we'll have Torres back. But, and obviously what Stalin did not want was, he knew perfectly well how paranoid the Americans were, that if there'd been some sort of communist uprising in France behind the American lines, then they would cut off Lend-Lease. And Stalin did not want to lose Lend-Lease even at that stage of the war, even when victory was in sight. And then there'd been the so-called the percentage agreement with Churchill in October 43, when what Churchill referred to rather unattractively as that naughty piece of paper, where he tried to do his own private deal with Stalin, which is very silly in a way. And the only country where Churchill felt that he had to insist on what they described as 90% British influence was going to be Greece. And Stalin stood by his word there. He made sure that the Greek Communist Party didn't. In fact, it was the Yugoslav Communist Party which was arming the Greeks in that particular civil war. Now, the Americans, of course, weren't interested at all, as we saw at Yalta. Roosevelt, who actually was quite cynical in his own particular way, he'd won the election. November 44, he won the election. He didn't need the Polish community in the United States to vote for him anymore. So he was perfectly prepared to sell the Poles because he had his obsession, and this is always the problem with politicians, with Western politicians at any rate, legacy. His legacy was going to be the United Nations. So providing he got a deal in the United Nations and he could persuade Stalin to join the war against Japan, that was all he was really cared about, because at that stage they still didn't know whether the atomic bomb was going to work. Now Churchill found himself completely isolated at Yalta, as we all know, in fact almost humiliated, because Roosevelt had refused to have any discussion with Churchill beforehand. He didn't want Stalin to think that the British and the Americans were ganging up against him. And there was no doubt that one only could see from that particular point, and especially afterwards when the Polish leaders, who'd been given a laissez-passer by Zhukov, were then immediately arrested by the NKVD, sent back to Moscow. Some of them were killed. That there was no question of Stalin honouring any free election in Poland or anything like that. And so from that point of view, I think certainly the Cold War was inevitable. Many people have marked it from 1947, from the meeting at Sklarska Poręba in Poland, when Stalin suddenly woke up to the fact that partly due to the Clay-Robertson Agreement in Germany, the introduction of the Deutschmark and the basically the decision to revive German industry, Stalin saw that as a sort of direct threat. I mean, that was almost back to his nightmare scenario of June 1941. And he overreacted, and it was also the Americans, of course, who were overreacting, because having not cared at all in 1945 about the future of Europe, they thought, oh God, we came to sort out Europe and save it from Nazism. We sorted it out at the end of the First World War. As far as we're concerned, we want to get the troops out. I mean, Churchill was shocked at Yalta to the core. When Roosevelt, without having warning him, suddenly announced, "Oh, we want to get our all-American troops out of Europe as fast as possible." Stalin must have thought, was obviously thrilled when he heard that, and Churchill was absolutely shaken to the core. So I think that there was, as I say, I would have said that the origins of the Cold War lay without any discussion in June 1941 and the shock of the Nazi invasion.
Thanks a lot.
Not at all. Artem, great pleasure to be with you.